If you think about it and weigh it, I'm good, I have no offense, and there is kindness, said the gray-haired grandfather Augusto Pinochet, who lived to be 91 years old. It was indeed hard to recognize in him that powerful military dictator who shocked the world with violence and cruelty, into which he plunged Chile for 17 years of his rule. The first thing that comes to mind for people is the tortures. And yes, they were diverse and shocking in their imagination. There were tortures with water currents and kidnapping of people, and concentration camps, and even stadiums instead of concentration camps. But there is also another fundamental economic reforms which, as usual, bear their fruits years after their implementation. And all this during the rule of Pinochet and after his departure from power. By the way, about the departure, the dictator, associated with the mass deaths of peaceful people, left power after fair elections. After such contradictions, the figure of Pinochet ceases to be unambiguous. And there are not a few people who consider Augusto the only correct dictator and reformer. They cite him as an exception to the rule. In this documentary, we will delve into the Chilean chaos and figure out who Pinochet was, how he persecuted communists, and what they ultimately responded to him with. How did the CIA interfere in the military coup in Chile? And what is the cost of economic prosperity for the average peaceful person? A lie behind black glasses. We begin the story on the 3rd of November of the 17th year. It was then that President Salvador Allende came to power in Chile. He turned the country to the left, towards socialist transformations. What's interesting here is this. In addition to large-scale changes in politics, Allende, naturally, also turned the economy. He began the full nationalization of all enterprises. And here problems began for Chile, as these actions stepped on the toes of many foreign companies, including American ones. In the diplomatic sphere, Allende was oriented towards the countries of the socialist bloc. Even before his election as president of the country, he visited the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics twice, and already as the head of state, he restored diplomatic relations with Cuba, Fidel Castro. Modern researchers suggest that Allende's pre-election campaign was actively financed from Moscow. The country's industry was well developed. Already in the middle of the century, gigantic copper reserves were found in the north of Chile, and the country quickly went through the stage of industrialization. Moreover, electricity appeared, and trams began to run in large cities. And all this in the 19th century. Just a moment. The reserves are so large that Chile is called the Kingdom of Copper. By the way, it still ranks first in the world in the extraction and export of this metal. Chilean copper accounts for about 34% of the global market. Copper has become the main commodity for sale on the global market. And a huge number of workers involved in extraction and transportation naturally sympathized with left-wing ideas, including Marxism and communism. What we told about copper mining is not just a historical reference. Salvador Allende's nationalization policy caused a confrontation with the United States of America, as South America has always been a zone of interest for the United States. His undermining and the main capitalist country understandably did not like the socialist turn in South America. Suddenly, a military coup was being prepared in Chile, in which many generals of the Chilean army were interested. It cannot be said for sure that the Americans played a major role in the military coup, but, as they say, the hand of the United States will remain invisible again. In the year 2023, declassified CIA documents showed that President Nixon, National Security Secretary Henry Kissinger, and the state government, which characterized Allende as a dangerous communist, knew about the military's plans to overthrow Allende long before the state coup. And there's no conspiracy here. These were the biggest scandals in the history of the CIA inside the states themselves. Immediately after the coup, the publication published an article under the headline CIA Chief informed palace representatives about a campaign worth $8 million against Allende in the 70s third years. The political aftermath forced President Ford to publicly acknowledge the CIA's operations in Chile, decisively denying any connection with the coup d'etat. At a press conference, Gerald Ford became the first president to publicly acknowledge and defend the CIA's secret operations, which the United Nations characterized as limited protection of Chilean democratic institutions from the threat of Allende. He stated that the actions of the CIA were in the best interests of the people of Chile, and undoubtedly in our best interests. The Senate investigation, which also revealed CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders, and similar investigative efforts in the House of Representatives, led to the adoption of legislation to strengthen checks and balances in CIA operations. The disclosed White House documents showed the dismay expressed by Ford and Kissinger about the possibility that covert operations could be limited. "We need the CIA and we need covert operations," Ford told his cabinet 9 days after the revelations were published. The article and subsequent stories from various sources about the CIA. As Kissinger later admitted in his memoirs, they had the effect of a hot pepper on a gas tank. In essence, the whole campaign was launched by an ordinary journalist, Seymour Hersh, an American investigative journalist and political writer. He was recognized in 1970 for exposing the My Lai massacre and its cover-up during the Vietnam War, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize. In the 1970s, Hersh exposed a scandal for reporting on the secret United States bombings in Cambodia and the CIA's domestic spying program. In 2004, he detailed the attempts and harsh treatment of American military personnel with prisoners in Abu Ghraib in Iraq. He is considered one of the best American authors working in the genre of investigative journalism. The investigation itself took many years and was based on 10 documents, which, in essence, are secret records of government negotiations and catches on contradictions in the words of official persons. But it's also not worth overestimating the role of the states. The main beneficiary, of course, was Augusto Pinochet. By that time, he had already made a military career from the very bottom. The deep reforms initiated by President Allende led to a terrible economic situation in Chile in the early stages, causing dissatisfaction, especially among the military elite. In 1972, Augusto becomes the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and, simultaneously, the commander of all the country's ground forces. In this position, Pinochet suppresses military unrest in the capital city of Santiago. There were several coup attempts. During one of them, the military moved towards the presidential palace in tanks. Since it was 9 in the morning, many government officials were rushing to work and ran into the military. A shootout began. In this chaos, journalist Leonardo Henriksen literally filmed his last minutes of life. After the shots, Leonardo fell, and the camera with him. The military overturn was suppressed. Later, the Minister of Internal Affairs, General Carlos Prats, resigned, and Allende appointed Augusto Pinochet in his place. For Pinochet, this event became a turning point. In essence, if it weren't for his cunning and ability to say the right words to the right people, Augusto would not have come to power. Literally, within a few years, Pinochet made his way to being practically the second man in the state. Having gone on leave, Prats, commenting on the president's decision, noted in his diary that a state coup was just a matter of time. And he was right. Up until the coup, Pinochet was considered one of the most loyal representatives of Allende's military command in Chile. A lie is revealed in the look. "And because I lied so many times, I wore dark glasses," Pinochet said about himself. The day before the coup, Pinochet gathered the officers who had betrayed him and ordered them to swear allegiance and kiss the flag of Bernardo Higgins, which Bernardo Higgins had brought with him, a revolutionary, national hero of the Republic of Chile, leader of the fight for the independence of South American countries from the Spanish Empire. During his time in power, he implemented a series of progressive reforms, abolished colonial taxes, established public primary schools, created libraries, and stimulated the development of the arts. And so, on September 11, 1973, the coup began. A military junta was formed, which, in addition to Pinochet himself, included several other generals. The very word junta, which we understand as a bloody military coup, is not perceived in the same way in Chile and other Spanish-speaking countries. The word junta translates from Spanish as assembly. Throughout history, there have been many different juntas, which, in essence, were executive governmental bodies. The troops that landed in Valparaiso headed towards the country's capital, Santiago. The army was able to quickly capture key points and radio stations that defended the Allende government. The junta's forces tried hardest to take the presidential palace, where several hundred of the president's personal guards were holding defense. Pinochet offered Allende a plane and promised to let him leave Chile's territory. But the president refused. The palace guard managed to knock out several attacking tanks. Then the junta's planes launched rocket attacks on the building. The defense was broken, and Salvador Allende died in the crossfire. According to legend, the president met his death in his own office. This event was commemorated in the painting The Murdered President by Wetzel Christoph. Nothing and no one else stood in the way of Augusto Pinochet's rise to power. Only the minor details of the Middle Ages remained, Chilean style. When Pinochet took power, he unexpectedly spoke about how the Marxists and the country's situation compelled them to seize control. That as soon as peace is restored and the economy is brought out of collapse, the army will return to the barracks. The general even set a deadline for achieving these goals of about 20 years, after which Chile will return to democracy. The activities of political parties were immediately banned, not only those on the left, which, in the opinion of the junta, posed a threat to the constitutional order, but even those that supported the military's actions. Pinochet and his associates announced the suspension of the country's main law and stopped the work of the parliament. A ruling junta was formed, which included the leaders of the military coup, headed by Pinochet. In a declaration published the same day, the new leaders of the country announced their main tasks: fighting the communist threat and creating conditions for the economic and social development of Chile. Pinochet's quote, "The secret to a good life in a country is simple hard work, obeying the law, and no communism. Of all our enemies, the most dangerous is the Communist Party. We must destroy it now while it is reorganizing across the country. If we fail, it will sooner or later annihilate us." Pinochet himself considered himself a Democrat. He coldly noted that democracy in itself carries the seed of its own destruction. Democracy needs to be watered from time to time with blood so that it remains a democracy. The dictator, by his own admission, put iron shackles on the nation. He always wore his cap 5 centimeters higher than the other generals in his surroundings, believing that it would bring him luck. Initially, Pinochet still considered himself on par with the other generals who participated in the military coup. When making those or other decisions, he consulted with his comrades. It was assumed that the leaders of the junta would periodically change, but Pinochet needed sole power, and the next steps were just that. First, he took the title of the nation's supreme leader, and then declared himself the President of Chile, which caused an uproar among other members of the junta. The military understood where things were heading. The first to openly speak about this was one of the organizers of the military coup, General Gustavo Lee, and a few years later he was forced to retire. Over time, all members of the junta either lost power, like Admiral José Moreno, or died under unexplained circumstances, like General Oscar Bonilla. After the removal of direct competitors, it was time for the Marxists and Communists. This was opposition in the broadest sense, from state trade unions, workers, those same copper enterprises, to armed red detachments, operating both in cities and in partisan areas, mountains and small settlements. Several thousand people were killed in the first month in Chile, and to this day I don't know exactly how many. Sources loyal to Pinochet talk about 3,000 killed. His opponents assert that this number should be multiplied by 10 at least. The brutality of the military junta shocked the Chilean left and did not allow them to mobilize forces for effective resistance quickly. Yes, and at the initial stages, this resistance could not lead to anything. The forces were too unequal. On Pinochet's side was a powerful army, financial support from Chilean oligarchs, special services. Almost all activists of the left revolutionary movement, MIR, the largest left radical organization in Chile, were either destroyed or thrown into prisons. The same fate befell the members of the Communist Party of Chile. The only method of resistance that the left could oppose to the military regime was guerrilla warfare. But unlike many other Latin American countries, in Chile, there were no traditions of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla from Spanish means war. It's a method of partisan warfare in the cities of Spain and Latin American countries. The activity of small armed groups aims to eliminate the military technical superiority of the enemy. Until urban guerrilla warfare turns into a nationwide uprising, creating a revolutionary situation, Chile is not geographically suited for partisan warfare in principle. Look, it's a very long strip of land between the Andes mountain system and the Pacific Ocean. Partisans couldn't operate for long in open space. They would simply be hunted down by Pinochet's aviation. In this situation, the Chilean communists began to help the rebels. After the repressions, the Cubans greatly assisted the emigration of the leftists from Chile. People were provided with housing. They were employed at Cuban enterprises. However, the Cuban authorities did not fail to remind the Chileans that they should actually be waging an armed struggle against the Pinochet regime, not sitting out in emigration. They also accused the left of failing to properly organize the defense of Salvador Allende's government and losing the war for the future of Chile. Nevertheless, in 1974, a meeting took place between the Cuban leader Fidel Castro and the leaders of the Chilean Communist Party, Volodya Teitelbaum and Rodrigo Rojas. After this, the Cubans allowed the Chileans to engage in military training on their territory, and also began to train immigrants in military affairs and even prepare officer cadres. This is an important moment, that very Chekhovian gun, which will still fire. Meanwhile, after the defeat of the armed left, Pinochet took on the intelligentsia and simply the dissenters and the nonconformists. The poet Pablo Neruda was killed, widely known in the world and the Soviet Union for his poems. In 1942, he wrote about the Battle of Stalingrad. Your vision is still clear, like the sky unbreakable. The solidity of your community, needed on a piece of bread. Oh, the boundary stake, the border of Stalingrad, your homeland. It's the laurel and the hammer. The gaze flies over the cannonade, and the fierce enemy freezes in the fierce cold and in the snow, covered with the blood of Stalingrad. Also brutally killed was the famous poet and musician Victor Jara. He was the most famous singer in the country. The people adored him because of his connection with the Chilean party. The executioners broke his hands, tried to electrocute him, and then, after long tortures, they shot him, firing 34 bullets into him. A journalist from the left-wing publication, Carmen Marador, was arrested. She spent 7 hours on the rack, was repeatedly raped, starved, beaten, had her legs broken, was tried with electric shocks, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to the most brutal and deadly tortures. Her relatives managed to free her, but she soon died from the tortures she had endured. These are the 3 most known examples. On a larger scale, things were much worse. People were put in prisons and specially built camps all over the country. In Santiago, where the prison system was already overwhelmed, people were herded into the National Stadium. Once associated with sporting events, it now became a symbol of brutal terror. About 40,000 people were held there under horrifying conditions. After the overthrow, as we told, a scandal broke out in the United States of America, and the American intelligence started to sound the alarm, but it was already too late. She argued that the number of people killed during the repression in the first months runs into the thousands. Meanwhile, the official Chilean government reported less than 300 killed. The mass terror lasted for around a year before subsiding, but not abruptly. No one threatened Pinochet's power anymore, and for individual cases, he created the National Intelligence Directorate. In fact, it was a political police, which was soon dubbed the Chilean Gestapo. National Intelligence Directorate agents hunted down opposition members not only within, but also beyond the borders of Chile. In 1974, General Prats, the same one who was replaced by Pinochet, emigrated to Argentina after his resignation. There, Pinochet's political police found him and blew him up with a car bomb along with his wife. And in 1976, Pinochet's hands reached as far as Washington, where former Foreign and Interior Minister Orlando Letelier Lovely was killed. The regime was also aided by international cooperation, or more precisely, the Union of South American Dictators. In 1975, a secret conference took place in Santiago, attended by representatives of the special services of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. In the official closing statement, the conference participants established a new joint security organization called Condor. At that time, the Pinochet regime was in international isolation and needed support against the spread of Marxism. A few years later, Brazil and Peru joined Condor. Almost all of South America became Pinochet's sphere of influence, and the Condor organization gained the reputation of one of the most notorious police structures in the Western Hemisphere. Dictators could cooperate and hand over disloyal people to each other. Nobody could do anything about it. Its activities spread across all the territories of the participating countries and included classic methods of South American dictatorships: surveillance, kidnapping of people, torture, interrogations, and elimination of political opponents. Pinochet's overseers used medieval torture methods that make the blood curdle in your veins and block the video. Water torture was widely used. They tie up a person, put a cloth on their face, and then slowly start pouring water on the cloth. The person experiences symptoms of drowning. They feel like they are sinking. This convinces the tortured person that they are dying. At the same time, water should not enter the lungs. At the beginning of the millennium, the television channel host decided to prove to the viewers that waterboarding is some kind of nonsense. To prove it, the host chose himself as the test subject. In the end, he lasted 15 seconds, after which he began to wheeze and cough and eventually lost consciousness. When he came to, he had a hard time recovering. This is a real torture. The electric shock torture was called Guerrilla. It's so brutal that we can't show it. Named after the eponymous word meaning a metal grill. This picture makes the analogy clear. And what does electric shock torture have to do with it? Later, the so-called death flights were established, where prisoners were loaded onto a military helicopter, gained altitude, and were thrown straight from the helicopter. Agent of that same Dina Asfaldo Romo admitted in an interview in 1995 that he participated in the death flights. Showing no remorse, he added, "Perhaps it would have been better to throw the bodies into a volcano." Interestingly, such flights were a brutal tradition not only in Chile, but also in other South American countries, for example, in neighboring Argentina. After long bouts of torture and starvation, the prisoners were told they were being transferred to a hospital. Victims, sometimes still on the ground, sometimes already in flight, were drugged with powerful substances, after which their unconscious bodies were thrown from airplanes and helicopters into the ocean. Typically, a flight included 2 pilots, 3 officers, and a doctor. This is what the planes looked like, which were most often used during the death flights in 1972. 68 participants of these flights ended up on the dock accused of killing almost 800 Argentine citizens. 29 of them received life sentences, 19 from 8 to 25 years in prison, and the rest were acquitted. Similar trials were held from 1885. During one of such trials, the defendant Alfredo Astis, a former third-rank captain of the Argentine Navy Special Forces, shouted, "I will never apologize for defending the motherland." But let's go back to Chile. At one of the press conferences, a local journalist asked Pinochet directly, "What do you think about the fact that they found 2 journalists in one grave?" To which Augusto replied, "What, I think? It's a good economy of space." Chilean mini-Reich. In all this madness, there is the most insane and mysterious story. It's about the Dignidad colony, a place shrouded in myths and legends. A decade after the end of World War II, Latin America became one of the main regions where former Nazi military criminals fled. A whole range of factors came together here: right-wing military regimes sympathetic to Nazi and fascist ideas, the significant geographical distance of Latin America from Europe, and the presence of large German diasporas. In 1966, Paul Schaefer, a former Luftwaffe aviator in Nazi Germany who served as a junior medic during World War II and lost an eye on the Eastern Front, arrived in Chile. He left the Federal Republic of Germany due to allegations of molesting minors. In Chile, Schaefer founded the Dignidad colony, officially designated to help orphans affected by the earthquake. However, the settlement quickly turned into a closed sect, existing outside the control of Chilean authorities. In the colony, strict discipline reigned, and Schaefer's sect relied on the labor of adepts, including children, engaged in farming, business, and, according to some data, even weapons production. After Pinochet came to power, the colony became a center for torture and elimination of political opponents. Collaborating with Chilean special services, Schaefer established close ties with the military and diplomats, which allowed him to evade investigations. Who failed to conduct successful economic activity? Over time, the colony literally flourished thanks to slave labor, the absence of tax burdens, and the entrepreneurial ingenuity of Schaefer and his company. Vegetables and fruits, meat and dairy products, honey, confectionery were profitably sold in Chile and Germany. Inside the perimeter of the settlement, a harsh regime operated with a mass of totalitarian sectarian rules and requirements, with psychological pressure and collective responsibility for misconduct. Torture, abuse, atrocities, and perversions were practiced. As it turned out, even after the liquidation of the commune, Schaefer and his team subjected hundreds of detainees to torture. Dozens of bodies were found in secret burials on the territory of the colony. There is even a conspiracy theory that Josef Mengele, Hitler's scientist-doctor who conducted experiments on people in the Auschwitz concentration camp, worked in the colony. But the theory is not substantiated. Mengele was found in Brazil, and there is no reliable evidence from Chile. In 1985, Boris Wefler, an American tourist and former resident of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, mysteriously disappeared in the vicinity of the colony. According to one hypothesis, the adventurer planned to infiltrate a secret facility to confirm the presence of Nazi criminals there and then gain fame for his investigation. Wefler disappeared without a trace in the colony, which allows only one sad conclusion. Only after the fall of the Pinochet regime did the colony lose its privileges, and charges were brought against Schaefer for his crimes. In 1997, he fled from Chile, but in 2005 he was arrested in Argentina and extradited. Schaefer was sentenced to 33 years in prison for crimes against minors, theft, and torture. He died in prison in 2010 at the age of 89. A film was made about these horrific events in 2015. The film was directed by the German Florian Gallenberger and starred renowned actors such as Emma Watson and Daniel Bruhl. The historical thriller received high ratings from film critics and caused a great stir among viewers around the world. However, this evil colony, despite all its cannibalistic essence, was just a small episode of the massive and secret evacuation of the Third Reich to South America. This process was thoroughly investigated by Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams in the book Grey Wolf: The Escape of Adolf Hitler. And for a complete picture, it will be very useful to familiarize yourself with this radical version of the author in the book. There is no unequivocal legal evidence that Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Stalin, in Potsdam on the 17th of July 1945, insisted that Hitler had managed to hide. And Zhukov, on the 6th of August, said so: "We did not find the recognized corpse of Hitler." DNA analysis of a fragment of Hitler's skull showed that it actually belonged to a woman in her 30s or 40s. It has been proven that the corpse of Eva Braun had no relation to Eva Braun herself, and it would have been strange for Hitler to end his life by suicide. Considering that at least since the summer of the 43rd year, there was a widespread and systematic preparation for evacuation in the Reich. Firstly, the party leadership, the state, and the SS were supposed to be evacuated from Germany. Secondly, gold, art objects. Thirdly, archives and the most advanced technology at that time. From the 43rd year, Bormann began to create hundreds of corporations beyond the borders of the Reich, into which Nazi money was invested, mainly party gold. This task was solved as part of an operation under the code name Flight of the Eagle. Accounts were opened in foreign banks. Investment funds were created in foreign companies. For example, in the 43rd to 45th years, more than 20 German companies registered their branches in Argentina. Monetary and other assets, such as patents for inventions, were transferred through subsidiary companies in Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal to Argentine branches of German banks. The funds were then directed to German companies operating in Argentina, such as the car manufacturer Mercedes-Benz. First, plant built beyond the borders of Germany. The central offices have imposed production restrictions on their foreign branches. The sums obtained from the difference between the real price and the transfer price were secretly placed in Argentine banks, and they could be withdrawn after the war without arousing suspicion from the Argentine authorities and, moreover, Western allies. The same companies after 1945 became a source of employment for Nazi war criminals. Adolf Eichmann worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory near Buenos Aires under the alias Ricardo Clemente from 1955 to May 11, 1966, until he was captured by agents of the Israeli intelligence service Mossad. Another important aspect of Operation Eagle Flight was the acquisition of shares or stakes in the capital of foreign companies, especially in North America. To solve this problem, Bormann turned to the once largest player in such games, the conglomerate. Since its foundation in 1926, this giant has acquired many American companies, and they have become part of this global cartel. By the time Germany declared war on the United States of America, it owned controlling stakes in 170 American companies and was a minority shareholder in another 108 companies. Bormann sought advice from its president, Hermann Schmitz, and former Reich Minister of Economics, Dr. Hjalmar Schacht. Together, they coordinated the transfer of Nazi funds through Swiss banks, the Bank for International Settlements, or through third parties. For example, the Jacob brothers, Marcus Wallenberg from Sweden, acquired through their Stockholm and Skilda Bank the company American Bosch Corporation, a subsidiary located in Stuttgart of the company Robert Bosch GmbH. By the beginning of 1945, Bormann had completed preparations for the evacuation of the Third Reich's leadership. All that remained was to evacuate the main villain of all times and peoples. Out of several escape options for Hitler, it was decided to use a scheme involving a half-kilometer underground passage, then metro tunnels, and then a plane. But first, those who were preparing to run had to die. More precisely, the doubles had to die. Hitler had no problems with doubles. He had a whole dozen of them. Most likely, Gustav Weber was killed, who began to replace the Führer after the assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944. After the plane delivered Hitler to the Canary Islands, he was taken aboard the submarine boat. After traveling 62 miles in 59 days, the submarine reached the shores of Argentina in late July, 1945. It is believed that Hitler died at the age of 72 on the 13th of April, 1962. Possibly, but considering the previous disappearances, one can assume that even the year 1962 is not the end. More on this a bit later. The world's top, primarily American, could not have been unaware that Hitler managed to escape. Moreover, the escape itself could only have been carried out as a result of a deal between the Nazi top and the Americans. What could the Nazis have thrown into the balance? Not a little. First of all, gold and art objects. Officially, the Americans only seized about 20% of the Reich's gold reserves, which financed the Marshall Plan. But they didn't find the party's gold, which was led by SS Obergruppenführer Franz Schwarz, and the SS gold. The plundering of Europe was one of the components of Hitler's policy, particularly, and of World War II in general. Germany's naval intelligence had compiled a list of the largest state and private collections of art, antiques, and numismatics in Europe as early as 1931. After the occupation, all that was needed was to send trucks to the designated addresses. This was an unimaginable theft, although it did take place. Hitler wanted to use the stolen valuables as a tool in future peace negotiations. Secondly, it's a lion's share of the Reich's technical achievements, patents, drawings, samples. Plus, the much-needed uranium-235 and explosives for the atomic bomb, without which the United States could only dream of nuclear dominance. In addition, By helping to form a Nazi underground in the form of a global network organization under the code name Fourth Reich, the Americans could count on using this force against the Soviet Union. But even after making the deal, Hitler could not trust the Anglo-Saxons, and that's why a double, not just one, but Hitler himself, stayed in Argentina. He had plastic surgery, and after some time, possibly in 1946 or a little later, he crossed over to Europe, to Germany or Austria, that is, where no one would have thought to look for him. One way or another, it is known that during the time of Director John Edgar Hoover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation kept data on every case of Hitler's appearance up until the 60s. Well, the news that periodically pops up on this topic serves as informational smokescreens for real events. Let's follow the fate of another man who was called the Mephistopheles of the Führer. Unlike Hitler, Bormann lived under different names in Latin America, shuttling between Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay, and leading the networked invisible Fourth Reich. But he didn't get to Latin America right away. In the summer of 1946, he crossed into Spain and lived for some time in the Dominican monastery of San Domingo. Interestingly, when in 1969 the Israeli intelligence started to approach the monastery, there was a fire, and it started in the part where the records of the inhabitants' guests were kept. In the year 1946, by the end of the summer of 1947, Bormann decided that it was time to move to Argentina, where huge resources had already been transferred. The president was more than sympathetic to Hitler, Nazism, and the Third Reich, Juan Perón. However, his wife Eva Perón, a harsh and ambitious woman, had a huge influence on him. In June of 1947, she arrived in Spain. The main part was the unofficial part of the visit, negotiations with Bormann, who was supposed to seal the pact of the Nazis with the Perón family. Values almost $1 billion in exchange for a safe life in Argentina. And here, the darling of the Argentine people has sprung a surprise. She told Bormann that he was left with a quarter of the wealth transferred to the country, and the rest was handed over through trusted persons for safekeeping in Swiss banks. Bormann could do nothing, as he was betrayed by several people dedicated to the secrets of the Gold Party. This scam of Eva Perón became possible thanks to the complicity and silent agreement of people in Argentina whom Bormann trusted more than anyone else: Ludwig Freude, Ricardo von Leute, Ricardo Stout, and Heinrich Dorga. They all had confidence in managing bank accounts opened in Buenos Aires for the Operation Fireland. However, Bormann was not one of those who forgive. The bankers who betrayed him began to die off quickly, one after another. Heinrich Dorga died under mysterious circumstances in 1949. Ricardo von Leite was found dead on a street in Buenos Aires in December of 1955, and Ricardo Stout outlived Leite by only a few months. Ludwig Freude, the main figure in Operation Fireland, died in 1952 after drinking poisoned coffee. Juan Duarte, the younger brother of Eva Perón, was shot in the head in 1954. According to the official version, he committed suicide. Evita herself fell ill with cancer and died in 1952 at the age of just 33. From 1950 to 1960, Bormann continued to lead the organization he created. On July 26, 1971, former Israeli intelligence officer Zvi Aldubi was quoted as confirming that Bormann is living on a ranch in Paraguay. Ladislav Farago, the author of numerous works on the history of intelligence and secret wars, claimed that he saw an aged Bormann in Bolivia. But after Perón's return to power in 1973, Bormann crossed back into Argentina. Manning, the author of a book about Bormann, claimed that as late as 1988, Bormann and Müller were still alive. What if the whole world knew about how the victors of the main evil of the century made a deal with this evil? How did they allow the #1 criminal of all time and nations to live peacefully and comfortably, not only for him, but also for his immediate environment? This would have been direct evidence that the Third Reich was an experiment to create a new world order. After all, it was in it that such things as the management of large masses of brainwashed population, a two-contour system of power, the party and the SS order structure, harsh social controls, and much more were worked out. In addition, the Third Reich was also a global business project of the Western elite. All this information suggests that both the new Swabia, the base in Antarctica, the flying saucers, and the Third Reich's contact with aliens are all specially launched information bubbles. They simply masked the information about the movement of huge financial flows. Agree, quite a crumpled version of, it would seem, all known historical processes. But let's get back to the main hero of our issue. How much does freedom cost? You might ask, how is it possible with all the above? Didn't they overthrow Pinochet's regime here? Were there people, excluding his close circle, who supported him? Yes, such people really existed, both within Chile and beyond its borders. And here's why Pinochet decided to change the economy of Chile to 180 degrees to conduct what is called shock therapy. Instead of nationalization, complete privatization of state property. A harshly balanced budget was adopted. All restrictions on trade with the world were lifted. A funded pension system was introduced. As a result, foreign investments flooded into the country. Cooperation with international financial institutions was restored, and the economy began to grow rapidly. The basis for the reforms was the ultra-liberal model, for which Chilean economists were responsible. Many studied in Chicago. Under the guidance of Nobel laureate Professor Friedman, the young reformers earned the nickname Chicago Boys. Milton Friedman, an American economist and neoliberal, a Nobel laureate in economics, the founder of the Chicago School of Economics, developed the economic theory of monetarism, was an advisor to United States President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Paradoxically, Pinochet managed to achieve what Allende failed to ensure: stable economic growth in Chile for many years. Initially, Pinochet's attempts looked futile. In his time, Allende increased government spending. Pinochet reduced it, but the economy was still declining. In 1975, industrial production in Chile fell by 12%. Allende closed the borders for import. Protecting the Chilean producer, Pinochet lowered import duties. And from 1975 to 1982, almost 2,800 Chilean industrial firms went bankrupt. But in the end, starting from the 80s, the Chilean economy began to pick up, first slowly, then faster and faster. Chile's gross domestic product per capita has grown 2.5 times over 30 years. They started talking about the Chilean economic miracle beyond the borders. Economists and politicians of various stripes have been picking apart the past years in Chile, trying to understand how the dictator managed to put the country on a new path of development. Margaret Thatcher was a devotee of Pinochet's reforms. She was sympathetic to the dictator's views on the economy and wanted to turn a blind eye to his crimes against humanity. Later, Thatcher sent Pinochet a bottle of scotch with a note saying, "Scotch is the only thing in Britain that will never let you down." Indeed, this happened under interesting circumstances, which we will tell about later. Economist Milton Friedman was also impressed by Chile's successes and even visited the country to verify the success of the reforms. And upon his return to the United States of America, the professor was met with protests from his students. They refused to study under the guidance of a man who didn't notice the huge elephant in the room, which throws peaceful people from a helicopter and tortures them with electricity. You have to understand that in the 80s, information didn't spread around the world as it does now. Many simply didn't know how Pinochet came to power and what he was doing in Chile. But some information did leak into the world media. Rallies discussing the events under Pinochet were held all over the world. And in the Soviet Union, the communists were in a rage after all the atrocities over the single-minded. Soon after the coup and the murder of members of the former socialist government of Chile, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and Chile were supposed to play decisive matches for the World Championship. The Chileans showed up for the match in Moscow, but the Soviet side categorically refused to fly to the return meeting in Santiago at the same stadium. As in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they did not try to move the game to neutral territory. All in vain. In the end, the Chilean team came out on the field without an opponent, scored a goal into the empty net, and the Soviet Union team was counted as a technical defeat. Moreover, in terms of player level, the Chileans were clearly in a losing position. and were not considered favorites. The Soviet team did not make it to the World Cup. You can't escape from the past. Then strange things happened, even for dictatorial regimes. After everything that happened with the country, Pinochet seemed to decide to take a step back and make everyone forget about the ongoing events and gain the support of the majority of the population. For this, he used referendums. Here again in history, the sad theory was confirmed. If the refrigerator is full. If a dictator did not ruin a person's life personally or the lives of his family, then such a person will not bother to understand what and how happened to the rest. He will go to vote for the candidate under whom the refrigerator became full. The first one took place in 1978, in which the Chileans answered only one question: whether they trust the activities of the military junta leader. 75% of those who voted supported Pinochet. Nothing is known about cases of falsification of results. Unsurprisingly, people were expecting changes after the prolonged crisis in the country. The next referendum took place in the 80s. The conversation turned to a new constitution. It was being developed over several years by loyal hench lawyers, and the rest of the political forces did not participate in its creation for obvious reasons. Interestingly, the constitution did not come into force immediately upon its adoption. Pinochet determined a transitional period, initially for 5 years, during which power remained in the hands of the junta. The result was 67% approval. But this time, questions have already arisen about the procedure itself. The vote took place under extraordinary circumstances and under total control by the authorities. But this was Pinochet's most important step in legitimizing his successes. Moreover, over time, bans on political activity were relaxed, but initially only for moderate right-wing parties. The socialists were still underground, and even those parties that were allowed were loyal to the authorities. But overall pressure on the opposition decreased. A new plebiscite took place in the 18th year. The Cold War ended, perestroika began in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Pinochet's regime was under threat. The thing is that the United States has been turning a blind eye to the existence of such anti-communist strongholds in South America and has not allocated significant resources to fight against dictators, especially after the CIA scandals. Moreover, Pinochet's old crimes finally started to surface in the international review, which affected Chile's relations with the world under Pinochet. And all this time, the Czechoslovakian weaponry left in Cuba was gradually being charged. The Chilean communists trained there over the years gained guerrilla warfare experience. In 1979, the first squad of Chilean communists entered Nicaraguan territory. They became the backbone for the Sandinista revolution, which, incidentally, was supported from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The revolutionaries greatly needed military specialists, particularly artillerymen, anti-aircraft gunners, and other military personnel. It was these personnel that the Chileans helped with. They participated in most of the major battles, including the direct capture of the Nicaraguan capital, Managua. One of the soldiers who broke into President Somoza's bunker was Galvarino Apablaza, one of the future leaders of the partisan movement in Chile, fought in Nicaragua, and Raúl Friedman, the future commander of the largest partisan organization in Chile. After the victory of the Sandinistas, many Chilean communists remained in Nicaragua to continue serving in the ranks of the Nicaraguan Revolutionary Armed Forces in command and instructional positions. In 1988, the Communist Party of Chile officially announced its transition to armed struggle against the Pinochet regime. However, long before this, separate left-wing radical groups had already been conducting regular raids in the country's territory. So, in 1975, the rebels carried out 132 partisan operations, during which they attacked army depots and armories with the aim of capturing weapons. The rebels used their bases in the mountainous regions located in the territory of neighboring Argentina, where they lived and prepared between operations. However, in 1976, a year after the military coup in Argentina, the Argentine Air Force destroyed these bases, which was a serious blow to the partisan movement. As a result, a lull came in Chile for some time. Nevertheless, as early as '83, the first major protest against Pinochet's regime took place in Santiago. The protest was harshly suppressed, but it set a precedent. Communists began to infiltrate Chile and subtly organize resistance, and most importantly, influence the views of Chileans, turning them against Pinochet's junta. Of course, it is also impossible to call the supporters of the underground saints. Experiencing a resource shortage, they engaged in the kidnapping of wealthy people and their relatives, demanding a ransom. They also levied Chilean entrepreneurs with a so-called revolutionary tax, something akin to a South American racket. Many subordinates engaged in similar activities in South American countries, for example, in Colombia. Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, from Spanish Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, is still functioning and conducting its fight. It consists of up to 20,000 people. It was formed in 1964 as the military wing of the Communist Party of the country. Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, members with weapons in their hands, fought for the creation of a state of social justice and social equality. The group raised money for its activities in an interesting way. In 1982, at a Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia guerrilla conference, they came up with the idea of levying a revolutionary tax on major cocaine producers. Colombians called them narco-partisans. As a tool of pressure on the government, the rebels used terrorist attacks, assaults on police stations, and kidnappings. In their time, they even managed to take presidential candidates hostage. Ingrid Betancourt. In general, their methods didn't differ much from Pablo Escobar's. Government forces regularly tried to clear the jungle of partisans, using both heavy artillery and bombers in military operations. Nevertheless, the rebels still control about 20% of Colombia's territory. Since 1964, in the course of constant conflicts, more than 220,000 Colombians have died, many of them civilians. Only in 2016 did the government sign a peace agreement with the rebel leadership in Havana, Cuba. With such a background, Pinochet's weakened external and internal regime approached the next referendum. It was about the possibility of extending Pinochet's full powers. Despite the dictator's promise to raise wages and allow opposition parties to participate in future elections, even the way the question was framed caused outrage among the population. Demonstrations rolled across the country, resulting in clashes with the police. And on October 5, 1988, 55% of voters voted against Augusto Pinochet. The presidential elections, the first since Pinochet's coup, were held in December of 1988. Pinochet put forward his own candidate, but he lost. The winner was Patricio Elwin, the representative of the Christian Democratic Party. Now it could be definitely stated that Pinochet's regime of absolute power was in the past. The dictator clearly did not anticipate this result. He was confident that the Chileans had forgotten the past and were looking to the future, where he still had a place in the same position. What we told about the assumptions of the failed referendum is very important. All these factors, the return of the left to the country, the changing mood in the world, and the general fatigue of the people, combined into an unbelievable puzzle for Pinochet. The first time he really loosened the reins and allowed people to make an honest choice. It was his own undoing. On the other hand, the word ruined is too inappropriate. Pinochet did not dare to face the people's wrath, because the constitution written by the military, Junta, not only gave the former dictator impunity, but Augusto even retained the post of senator. He held and used this post with pleasure until the year of 1998. And that's because he himself retired due to health problems. After retirement, Pinochet went to the United Kingdom for surgery, where he was completely unexpectedly arrested. While in Chile, the investigation of his crimes was hampered. European countries did not experience such restrictions. The Spanish court issued an arrest warrant for him, as during his rule many Spaniards who had ended up in Chile or were already there disappeared without a trace or were killed. The loudest case was related to the Spaniard Carmelos Ria, a United Nations employee. He was poisoned with a nerve paralytic gas, which is 16 times more deadly than cyanide. However, Pinochet's case soon turned into an internal problem for Great Britain. Extradition requests were denied, as the British court recognized immunity for the general as a senator, but the House of Lords, on the contrary, recognized the arrest as legal. As a result, thanks to the bail posted by his lawyers, Pinochet remained in a London hospital during the investigation and could not leave it. Incidentally, Margaret Thatcher sent a bottle of scotch to the former dictator in the year 2000. At the end of the arrest, British authorities deported Pinochet to Chile. He spent the last 6 years of his life in a military hospital in the capital. During this period, the Chilean court continued to consider new charges, including questions of his immunity and legal responsibility in connection with senile dementia. The trial of the former dictator became one of the most resonant events of that time. Pinochet was incriminated in murders within the framework of Operation Condor, kidnapping of people, as well as participation in illegal arms and drug trafficking. Many of his former comrades were convicted, however. The general himself evaded punishment for several charges. At the end of 2006, Pinochet suffered a massive heart attack and died on December 10th in a military hospital in Santiago. And so ends the story of Augusto Pinochet. Some would say that he spent the last years of his life terribly, being seriously ill, dragged through courts, until his health finally gave out. But on the other hand, how many dictators do you know who lived to be 91 and died of natural causes? And in general, how many people do you know who have lived to be 91? In any case, since then, nothing in Chile has come close to the level of upheaval that people had to endure at that time. After all, the country is now one of the most successful in its region. Within the Latin American region, Chile has the highest gross domestic product per capita. In 2023, Chile entered the top 5 safest countries in Latin America, after Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Argentina. The Chilean passport ranks 16th in terms of freedom of movement. Its main advantage is the absence of the need to obtain a visa for the United States of America and other countries. In the Global Competitiveness Index, Chile ranks 33. This index evaluates countries based on 12 criteria, including political institutions, infrastructure, macroeconomic stability, education, labor market efficiency, financial market development, technology, innovation, and business. Looking confidently into the future, Chile helps not only with the copper necessary for the whole world, but also, for example, lithium. The prevalence of the liberal economic model did not prevent the government from announcing plans to nationalize the lithium industry, as the country has almost 10 billion tons of lithium. Only Bolivia and Argentina have more substantial reserves. Considering the boom in electric cars, the government clearly sees such a decision as a chance for an economic takeoff. After all, according to economists' forecasts, the demand for lithium by the year 2040 could increase more than 40 times. Today, Chile is among the leaders in the rating of political transformation. On the one hand, democratic governments are trying to construct a negative image of Pinochet and everything associated with him. Even in the 0 years under President Ricardo Lagos, victims of repression were compensated. On the other hand, there are always supporters in society who believe that Pinochet was not so wrong. Now, this is facilitated by problems with internal security in the country. Pinochet and his harsh measures against unrest and tranquility are positively perceived by those who are dissatisfied with the government's policy. Several times in the country, they tried to replace the constitution that has been in effect since Pinochet's time. But last year, another such attempt suffered a defeat, because there were too many questions to the text of the new version. Simultaneously, the nation, though critically, connects to the dictatorship's legacy. And there is even such a concept as the trauma of Pinochetism. The market economy, built during Pinochet's time by the Chicago Boys, satisfies everyone. As for the very Chilean economic miracle, its flip side was that as the market saturated and business activity grew, the social functions of the state literally disappeared before our eyes. In fact, as it was intended, the entire social sphere, including pensions, was handed over to private hands. Unemployment, especially after the crisis, which began in the 80s, held at the level of 20% for several years. The privatization processes were accompanied by the personal enrichment of the dictator's family and the elite groups close to it. As a result of the Pinochet privatization, the state lost approximately $6 billion. Of the 15,000 privatized companies, more than 2/3 went into private ownership, in circumvention of the legislation. The Friedman liberal model designed for the flawless operation of institutions, entered into symbiosis with telephone law, cronyism, and other peculiarities of the regime. Today, the expert community expresses different points of view regarding Pinochet's legacy, but the very concept of the Chilean miracle is largely reconsidered. So it turns out that this figure still sparks heated debates among people. What do you think about this? Write in the comments. It will be interesting to read, and see you in new episodes on our channel.
This is not a dictatorship, sir. This is life prolonging. But if necessary, we will have to tighten measures, because we must first save the country and then look back. And therefore, I am sure that only when Chileans see what communism is, when Chileans understand the deception, the lie, how they are led astray, they will realize that the government is right.